Hi, and welcome to the next video of our seminar History of English 2 from Synthetic to Analytic. Today, we're going to start a new block on Middle English, that is, English being spoken after the Norman Conquest of 1066 until approximately the end of the 15th century. That is the time of the High Middle Ages and the Renaissance. What we are going to cover in this video is first some general remarks on the periods of the history of the English language, after which we're going to hear a short introduction to how Middle English has actually been pronounced based on the general prologue by Geoffrey Chaucer from his Canterbury Tales. And then we'll wrap up by pointing out the fact that English was at that point still not a standardized language, and there was a huge variation present in the daily communication of the speakers. Right, so let's turn to the general remarks. So what I wanted actually to talk about are the temporal dimensions of Old English and also of other stages of English, but Old English was the first topic that we covered in our seminar, and that's why I would like to turn to that right now. So, as you know, Old English was the variety, or is the variety, that was spoken on the English in England, on the British Isles, from approximately half of the 5th century until the Norman Conquest of 1066. But we can say that approximately from 450 until 1050. That is 6 centuries, right? And so when English speakers came to Britain, they developed for 600 years, and England at the time of the Norman Conquest looked approximately like this, right? So it's not, so you have England, which officially a part of England were also huge parts of France. This is also something that you might probably know that resulted into the 100 Years' War between France and England. But the important thing is this is 600 years of history and of language development, language evolution, language change, right? And if you try to think back, what was the world like 600 years ago from our perspective, it's really something that we don't really think that much about, right? So 600 years ago, America was not discovered yet. South America was not yet discovered by Europeans, that means. South of Spain was still controlled by the Emirate of Granada until 1492, right? So this is also something that nowadays is not really something we know. Protestantism was not founded yet, right? So Catholic Church was still the only church, the only Christian church in Europe. But there was the so-called Western Schism between different popes, right? One in Rome and the second one in Avignon in France. Constantinople was still the capital of the Byzantine Empire. It was not Istanbul, and it was not Turkey, right? As I said, 100 Years' War between France and England was ongoing, and this war lasted until the year 1453, right? There was no coronavirus in Europe back then, but there was Black Death, plague, and Catholic heretics were burned at stake, right? So this is the world that was 600 years ago. And we would definitely not want to analyze everything within this period as one unit. But this is actually what we do when we talk about Old English, right? So there are different stages of Old English, and Old English or English underwent a tremendous amount of change during that time. And if we think not about the past, but about the future, right? So those of you who are fans of the Star Trek universe, you'll know that actually Captain Jean-Luc Picard flew in his Enterprise in the 24th century, right? So that is less than 600 years from now. And this is for us the science fiction, right? So future and everything. But in Old English, we really cover 600 years of history within one period. And during this period, there were things that happened also outside of the language that affected English to a high degree, right? So first, the Anglo-Saxons, the Old English speakers, came to settle on the British Isles. Then the Vikings invaded England and established the so-called Danelaw, where they spoke Old Norse. And after that, the Normans came, right? In 1066, William the Conqueror invaded England and brought French with him. And this is something that I wanted to draw your attention to, the sort of linguistic situation in England at the turn of these two periods between Middle English and Old English. So we have Old English or English varieties, right? English was not a standardized language yet, and there are different dialects, different varieties being spoken in different regions of England. But then there are also the Celtic languages, like Welsh in Wales and Gaelic in Scotland and Ireland, Cornish and Manx, right? So there is another group of speakers. And then there are other Germanic languages, right? So the varieties of Old Norse being spoken by the Viking by the Viking community in the Danelaw. But that is also not all, right? So we also have Latin, a Romance language that is being used as the official language of the church, the language of the universities, and also being used for official documents of the country. And then after 1066, we get French. And French after 1066 becomes the first language of England, and is being spoken by the king, right? So William the Conqueror grew up in Normandy, speaks French, and French is also the language of the cultural elite or the administrative elite of the country after the Norman Conquest. And it takes approximately 2 centuries until the so-called Provisions of Oxford in 1258, when English is used in an official document once again, right? The 2 centuries before that, French or Latin were the official languages. And it is only in 1362 that Edward III introduces actually English as the language of the courts in England. Before that, if you wanted to go to court, you had to speak French. In 1363, Edward III also is the first king after 1066 to address the parliament in English, right? So before that, again, it was French. And many of the kings after the Norman invasion actually were native speakers, not of English, but of French. And some of those monarchs actually never spoke English, but were only speakers of French, right? So now we have a situation where there are different languages that also influence each other to a different degree, obviously. And if we talk about French and French influence on the English language after 1066, we very often only speak about French in general, but in fact there were at least 2 varieties of French that were important in that in that time. And these two varieties can be differentiated by the fact whether they are spoken north of or south of the so-called Jaurès line, right? So this is this red line that distinguishes two different varieties of French. And we can actually see that those two varieties of French influenced English if we look at loanwords, right? Because this northern variety of French was spoken by William the Conqueror and his men who invaded England. And this southern variety of French that was also spoken in Paris, the so-called Central French, influenced English in another way later on. And we can see the difference between these two varieties if we look at the so-called doublets, right? So a loanword that is borrowed into English from French twice, but once from the northern variety as catch with the k sound in the beginning, and then later on from Central French as chase, right? Both words are cognates from the same Latin ancestor, but once in the northern varieties, the Latin k remains unpalatalized, whereas the southern variety of French, Central French, actually palatalized the k sound to a ch or sh, so chase. We also get, for example, the present-day English word garden, which comes actually from these northern varieties. In French, it would be jardin or something like that. Right. This is, by the way, a cognate with the English word yard. Also, sort of an enclosed space where something grows. Another distinguishing feature between these two varieties is whether they have a w sound, a v sound, or a g sound, right? So whereas we have which is actually a loanword in English, war. This is a word borrowed from the northern variety, from Norman French. In French, right? In Central French, the word for war is guerre, and there is also a similar loan word from Spanish, the guerrilla, which also shows the unchanged g sound, right? Then we also have other doublets such as warden and guardian, which are basically the same thing, but one word, warden, is from the Norman French variety, whereas guardian is from Central French. And the same thing applies also to words such as warrant in the north and guarantee from Central French, right? So even French is not French, but there are at least these two important varieties of French in play in Middle English, right? And I've been talking about the different contacts and the different degree of contact between those two, between different language communities. And if we take a look at how intense the contact between those communities is, we can actually predict, or this has been documented, that the type of borrowing or the degree of influence between these communities differs based on how intense the contact between them is. So in the very superficial level of contact would be the very first line, where one community only borrows sort of contentful words for things that they don't have, right? So the English loan word sauerkraut for a thing that is known from the German-speaking area. But if the contact is actually more intense, you can also borrow not only content words, lexical words, but also grammatical words, grammatical morphemes, such as, for example, the derivational affixes in English, such as itty, right? But also different pronouns. We are going to see that in Middle English, where Middle English or English actually borrowed some of the pronouns for the third person plural, actually from Old Norse, right? Right, and the more the higher the intensity of language contact, the more grammatical elements can actually be borrowed, which is not something that normally happens. That is also why when we talked about reconstructing a dead language in the very first session, we talked about the core vocabulary of the language that is not really affected by different by language contact situations. Well, not always, but sometimes even the core vocabulary can be affected, as actually happened in English, as we're going to see throughout the next weeks. Right, so Middle English developing from Old English was really affected by the extra-linguistic situation in the area, some language contact with, most importantly, French, but also Latin and Old Norse, and then to a lesser degree with the neighboring Celtic languages. Right. So now let's have a look at one of the most prominent examples of Middle English, and that is the work of Geoffrey Chaucer, Canterbury Tales, and the very beginning of this text, the so-called general prologue. Here you can actually see the manuscript, how the text looks like, and in a second you're going to hear this text being pronounced. For now, simply listen to the text, and try to understand as much as you can. I think that you will find that it's more that you can understand way more than if somebody reads Old English to you. We're going to work with this text in the handout for our next online session, so you don't have to worry. But for now, just listen to Middle English being spoken.
When that April with his surest sote the drocht of marsh hath pierced to the rote, and bathed every vein in switch liquor, of which vertu engendered is the floor. When Zephyrus sate, with his sweet breath, inspired hath in every holt and heath the tender croppes, and the youngest son hath in the ram his half a course run, and smale fooles maken melodie, that slaten all the nicht with open ear, so pricket hem natur in her courages. Then longen folk to gon on pilgrimages, and palmeres for to seken stronge strondes, to ferne houes, coos in sondry londes. And specially from every sheeres ende of Engeland to Canterbury they wende, the holy blissful martyr for to sake, that hem hath holpen when that they were sake. Befell that, in that season on a day, in Southwark at the tabard as he lay ready to wenden on me pilgrimage, to Canterbury with full devout courage, at nicht was coming to that hostelrie, well 29 in a company of sundry folk, be avanturi fall in fellowship, and pilgrims were they all, that toward Canterbury woulden reade. The chambres and the stables weren weede, and well way weren aised at the best. And shortly when the sun was to rest, so had he spoken with him every tune, that he was of her fellowship anon, and made forward early for to rease, to talk our way there as he you devise. But natheless wil I have timen spase, dat I verder in this tale passe, may thinketh it according to reason, to tell you all the condition of each of them, so as it seemed may, and which they weren, and of what degree, and eke in what array that they were in. And at a knecht then will I first begin.
Right. So this is the text that we are going to work with during our next online session. The text can be found on Blackboard in the handout. Right. So now let's turn at the very end of this video to dialectal variation in Middle English. Right. So as I said, English at that time was still not a standardized language, but there were differences between the different regions, between different dialects, and this was something that people had to cope with when they tried to write texts. Right. So William Caxton, who was the person who actually introduced printing press to England and started printing first books in England, described, or he probably invented, this short story where he explains what problems actually this variation what problems this variation causes in daily life, right? And again, Middle English. I'm going to try to read that out for you. So the background information that you need is that there is a group of merchants going somewhere, and on their way to their goal, they want to buy something, and they stop at a shop and want to buy food. Right. And one of these merchants, right, namens Scheffelde, a mercer, kam into een huis en asked for meat, and specially he asked after eggs. And the good wife answered that she could speak no French. Right, so the merchant asked for eggs, but the lady working there could not understand him and said, "Okay, sorry, but I don't speak any French." And the merchant was angry, for he also could speak no French, but would have had eggs, and she understood him not. Right. But then the merchant was also angry because he could also speak no French, but was angry because he simply wanted his eggs. And then at last another said that he would have eieren. Then the good wife said that she understood him well. Right. So another of the merchants, one from the group who was familiar with the variety being spoken in the place where they were right now, said, "Oh, but he doesn't want eggs, he actually wants eieren," right? And that was something that the lady in the shop understood. And so William Caxton concludes, "Lo, what should a man in these days know rete, eggs or eieren? Certainly it is hard to please every man because of diversity and change of language." Right? So there were, at least at this very superficial lexical level, there were also differences between the varieties of Middle English, and this is also something that we're going to have a look at in more detail in one of the next weeks. Right. But more about that, as I said, later on. For the next time, please read the preparatory text, where you'll read some more details about the Norman Conquest and its influence on the development of English. And then please take a look at the handout, where you have the text of the general prologue by Geoffrey Chaucer, and try to read the text and analyze it the way we actually did that with Old English texts, with the colloquies, and concentrate on the following. First, try to find as much evidence of French influence on English in the text as possible, and also try to find evidence for the gradual shift from synthetic Old English towards more analytic present-day English, right? So what we already know, what synthetic and analytic is, and try to find differences, for example, if compared with what you know about Old English. Okay, that's all for today. Thank you for your attention, and we'll see each other during the online session. Bye.